there is a very common theme amongst religious scripture and in mythology as well of not only man being the vicegerent or the representative of the divine on earth, but also that man in a sense reflects divine attributes, or that he is the manifestation of certain divine actions. This does not necessitate anthropomorphism necessarily, but rather it refers to the honor man has in that he reflects certain aspects of the divine. These attributes that man has, whilst not being in the same meaning or in the same sense as they are attributed to God, it does reflect the status that man has within the creation, amongst creatures, and in the earth, so to speak. We see this within various religious scripture, of course. The Bible, the Old Testament, talks about man being created in God's image, in his likeness. We also see, for example, in certain mythologies, the figures are often men, they're often people who tend to reflect certain divine attributes. Indeed, they may be considered manifestations of God. And we also see, for example, this in the Hindu tradition where, certain avatars, certain figures are sort of manifestations of God on earth, and in various mythologies as well. We also, and most importantly for this video, in the Quran, whilst of course the Quran does not talk about God manifesting himself in this creation or becoming incarnate blood and flesh, we do see the theme of man reflecting certain divine attributes. How could this be the case? First of all, we need to keep a few things in mind here. When we say that God, his attributes are manifested within the creation, this does not necessitate per se that the attributes of the creator and the attributes of the created are the same. As a theological point within the Islamic tradition, agreement in wordings do not necessitate agreement in meanings. Hence, the meaning of certain words, certain attributes, when applied to God, carry a completely and totally different meaning, understanding, and reality than when they apply to creation. And as such, one would take the principled approach that God does not at all resemble his creation in any way. Hence, his attributes do not resemble the creation's attributes in any way. Regardless of that, though, this talk about reflecting divine attributes more so refers to a manifestation of these attributes within the creation, whereby these are virtues of perfection, of goodness, of holiness that God has bestowed upon man specifically and chosen for him from amongst his creation. We also may note here the story of Adam, the creation story. Of course, like I mentioned, the Bible talks about God creating man in his likeness, in his image, but the Quranic narrative presents a wholly different aspect to all of this, where it suggests that God وَعَلَّمَ آدَمَ الْأَسْمَاءَ كُلَّهَا. God directly taught Adam the names of all things, that he taught him and bestowed upon him a certain kind of special knowledge that he did not bestow upon his other creations. And this is also evident from the fact that he asks the angels that, tell me about these things if you know. And they said that we don't know, you're the one who knows these things. And that demonstrates that there's this kind of special knowledge that man has, and that man manifests or represents or reflects this kind of special knowledge that only he has been given. Of course, what distinguishes man from other creatures, as per classical Islamic metaphysicians and theologians, is this knowledge or this ability to reason that man has that none of these other creatures have. In that respect, man reflects divine attributes of knowledge and wisdom. The Quran also mentions that God خلق الإنسان, he created man, and علمه البيان, he taught him speech, how to speak eloquently. And so this eloquence can also be taken within this broader meaning here. Of course, some may suggest that the opposite is true, that the divine, that our conceptions of God reflect our conceptions of what man should be like. It's an interesting take which reverses it on its head. But there's a point to be made here, perhaps, that if you are a believer, if you are one who believes in God, not just a Muslim per se, but a theist in general, one who believes in organized religion, you will believe that man reflects certain divine attributes, or perhaps, he manifests some of these characteristics, whereas obviously if you're an atheist or agnostic, you would take the opposite view. Of course, our conceptions of divinity are influenced by our conceptions of ourselves, but the Islamic narrative perhaps would take this one step further, transcending this completely by arguing that God is absolutely transcendent and cannot be subjected, his essence and his attributes cannot be comprehended fully by human reason per se, or they cannot be fully understood in terms that apply to the creation. Yes, we can partially know of certain attributes of God, and by this come to a certain kind of knowledge of him. Although there are many attributes that we can discuss here, there are a few other attributes which would be pertinent to mention. One is power, divine power, or qudra as the Arabic term is this ability that God has over all things. Indeed, God is most capable over all things, as the Quran declares. And the great Indian philosopher Muhammad Iqbal mentions that power is more divine than truth. In other words, God's power, God's ability over all things reflects his divinity in such a powerful manner. And similarly, man's authority, man's position of power over his creation is a reflection of that. It pertains and is encompassing of all of his creation. Man's power and authority and ability to subjugate the creation, the plants, the animals, and his domain over the earth, reflects that immense power. And another aspect is self-reliance or independence. God says that Wallahu al-ghani wa antum al-fuqara, that God is independent and you are dependent upon him. And this kind of self-reliance that humans are supposed to have reflects this independence. And it's interesting because the Quranic narrative suggests that God has created man as a Khalifa of his, as a Vicegerent of his on his earth. And hence, man being the Vicegerent of God on his earth reflects these divine attributes, whether it be power, knowledge, or self-reliance.